Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shells, desolators, peasants, vassals, minions. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about something that is an interesting topic for me, particularly because I'm not one of those people that doesn't really see the World War III scenario and sees that the interconnections, particularly globalization and these economic connections, particularly between oligarchs around the world, are far more complex now, and that these wars are perhaps a thing of the past, these large wars. Regional wars are great because it makes a lot of money for everybody involved, except for the people that live in the land where the war is happening. But anyway, what I want to talk about is the interesting relationship between Israel and Russia, because Israel has a new friend, as it turns out. And the closer you look at it, the more interesting and complex it gets to be. And this showed up recently because Israel, for the first time, abstained in supporting the U.S. vote to condemn the Crimea-Ukraine action. And so that was an interesting step by Israel. And so we see a lot of these partnerships shifting and morphing, this complex web of relationship between Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the like, all kind of establishing their own foreign policies. Because we saw a breakdown of unity in these Middle East campaigns, particularly with Iran and Syria. So it's complex because we have this interesting relationship with Israel and Russia. Yet we have Russia continuing to supply weapons to the Assad regime in Syria, and the fact that the Russians have offered to work with Iran as well. And that's a complexity, but that's the real world. That's realpolitik. That's the way things work in this economic world we live in now. And the Israeli relationship with Russia is also complex because, as it turns out, there's a huge Russian presence in Israel. In fact, Russian is the third most spoken language in Israel behind Arabic and Hebrew. So this is the largest number of Russian speakers outside of the former USSR. So they have a great deal of influence there, and there's a lot of connections with the homeland. And of course, a lot of these Jews moved to Israel from Soviet persecution all the way back through the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until the dissolution. And there's not a huge amount of trade between Israel and Russia, $2 billion in trade in 2012, compared to, say, Israeli-EU trade, which is $42 billion. And but it's comparable to what they have with China. Israel's trade with China is $8 billion in 2012, so $2 billion is a fairly small market, but they're developing an important relationship, and of course this is going to be increasingly important with Israel's central position in that region with all the Eurasian and Caucasian pipelines, and particularly because we also have Israel becoming an energy player, and Russia is going to work with them on that. So first of all, let's get into some background, as I like to do, and I'll just do some brief history and then get into some recent Russian-Israeli agreements and relationships that show how this relationship becomes increasingly more complex. So first of all, it turns out Stalin supported Zionism. In 1947, he supported the partition and creation of Israel, a partition of the two-state solution, Palestine and Israel, by the UN. And one of the reasons, because he felt like the new Israel would be a socialist state, and certainly there were some socialist aspects to the Jewish state, but that's what he had hopes for. And Russia recognized Israel 3 days after independence, and so early on they were on board with the creation of Israel. In fact, the Soviets provided Czechoslovakian weapons to Israel in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So all the more interesting that by the 1950s, Soviet attitude changed towards Israel, and they began arming Syria and Egypt. as well as Libya, Algeria, Iraq, and in fact, the USSR threatened to intervene in both the 1956 war and 1967 war involving Israel, and that could have been very complex very quickly, needless to say. And then, of course, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia resumed relationship with Israel in the 90s, and now they have a very cozy relationship. And when I say cozy relationship, I'm talking about these sort of arrangements. In 1999, there was a $1 billion sale of Israeli-Russian joint production military aircraft to China. So that involves an extra layer of complexity. Supposedly we're going to have World War III scenarios, or Russia and China joining in on wars against Israel if there's any actions against Iran or Syria, and yet we have Israelis working with Russians to build jets to sell military aircraft to China, who potentially are United States nemesis. And then in September 2010, Russia and Israel signed a 5-year military agreement, and a lot of it had to do with purchase of technology and weapons, and that's what Russia gets out of the deal, access to a lot of high technology from Israel. In October 2010, there's a $400 million deal with Russia to build and sell drones in Russia and to Russia. So once again, we find a lot of U.S. taxpayer-funded military technology that's virtually given to Israel over the years, and they turn around and take the technology and develop it and sell it to Russia and China. And then in March 2011, we had a cooperation agreement between the Russian and Israel space agencies. So these are pretty far-reaching agreements. So it becomes clear that Russia and Israel have a very tight relationship. And then in November 2013, there was a meeting with Putin and Netanyahu, and according to an Israeli newspaper, which I'll post below, Putin allegedly promised to ensure Israel's security in the region. And Netanyahu asked Putin not to push the demilitarization and the denuclearization of the Middle East. And Putin reportedly agreed that Russia would block efforts to convene a nuclear arms conference. And there's not necessarily any confirmation that this conversation took place, but the fact that after this Putin-Netanyahu meeting, theoretically, Putin allegedly promised to ensure Israel's security in the region is an interesting idea indeed. And once again, points to some complexity in these supposed conflicts that could arise, creating these World War III scenarios involving Iran and Syria, where I say that these things will play out, and we will not see World War III. So then, and then in December of 2013, Russia's Rosatom and Israel's Atomic Energy Commission signed a cooperative agreement. So here we have Russia and Israel's atomic energy organizations collaborating, and they have similar agreements on energy and agriculture. But once again, that's pretty interesting that we have Russia and Israel working together in the nuclear industry, and yet there's supposedly going to be a showdown with Iran over their nuclear capabilities. And then we have a December of 2013 as well. There's negotiation of a free trade agreement between Russia and Israel. So that comes at certainly an interesting time now, as it turns out, as the U.S. is pushing for sanctions, more sanctions against Russia, and yet we have Israel on the verge of signing a free trade agreement with Russia. And that includes open visa zones and open air flights between the two countries, which makes a lot of sense because, like I say, the Russian is the third most spoken language in Israel. So, needless to say, they're going to have a lot of close ties, certainly on a social level. And then back in August 2012 as well, Russia was negotiating with Israel and Cyprus over the new natural gas discoveries, and that's where it really gets interesting because we have Russia, and I'm undoubtedly U.S. companies will be involved in helping develop the natural gas discoveries now that are claimed off the coast. And this is going to be a big boon for Israel. And like I say, they'll necessarily have to get involved with a lot of the Eurasian, Caucasian, Middle Eastern pipeline systems to transport this. And interestingly enough, Israel's also offering, potentially to Russia, contracts on the Golan Heights. So now we see with the war in Syria that Israel's going to essentially forever claim rights to the seized land from Syria on the Golan Heights, and are so sure of it they're going to sell contracts for natural gas and oil exploration in Syria. And another interesting thing is that Israel was able to pressure Russia into not selling some sophisticated surface-to-air missiles to Iran. And once again, that bespeaks of not necessarily a World War III scenario or a showdown with Russia over Israel and Iran. And in fact, Iran is suing Russia over that canceled missile sale. And so we see a very complex relationship between Israel and their brand new friend Russia, and maybe they can get the United States off the hook now if this meeting took place between Putin and Netanyahu. And Putin allegedly promised to ensure Israel's security in the region, so maybe you can have Russian taxpayers take turns supporting Israel for a while. And but like I say, I think this once again bespeaks of the extremely complex nature of the relationship between countries around the world, and the fact that the oligarchs have more in common, and that these business interests will supersede any of the old geopolitical confrontations we used to see with militaries across the globe. And but as I always caveat, I don't want to rule out the fact that a confrontation can happen, because we do have sociopaths and psychopaths running all the countries of the world. So there we have it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.